is been found is that if you track uh, funding and those who get funded over the span of last 30 or 40 years, what you notice is that the median age of people who get funding shifts with that over time. So what that indicates is that the same group of individuals who were there at the beginning of this funding scheme, this implementation of this funding scheme, are the ones who prioritarily get this funding. And so that's kind of there exists, people have different terminologies for this, but there exists a limited pool of individuals who get this. It's almost like a brotherhood of club. Now, that's one aspect of it. If you take it further into things like drug development, out of basic research, but actually applied research and applied science, whether it be, and I come from the biomedical space, so I'm going to speak mostly about the biomedical space. When it comes to drug discovery and drug therapies, there's this scenario where most science is very difficult to achieve, right? Science is rife with failure. And so investors are very risk averse when it comes to funding scientific projects, right? It takes billions of dollars to bring a basic scientific therapy to market. That's a lot of money. And when that's rife with failure, of course, investment companies, pharmaceuticals, VCs are going to be very choosy with how they do it. But the problem with that is that there becomes what that creates is this phenomenon known as the valley of death, where there's a lot of science, basic science, that has fundamental substance to it. So it has a lot of potential. But because investment companies are risk averse or the therapies don't align with their particular incentives or their agendas or the political agendas, these research does not get funded. And so there's a lot of really potential useful things that can increase the quality of life of humans that are kind of just left to the wayside. And so what DeSci is doing is similar to DeFi, and I'm going to relate it back to DeFi often, is we're trying to develop these alternative funding structures that take it out of the sole hands of VCs and government and bring it back to the people. So a good example of this is, let's say you're a patient group. Let's say you have a rare disease. You're a group of individuals who have rare disease, and there's somebody who is trying to develop a therapy for your particular disease. Now, pharma doesn't tend to really focus too much on this because the population, the cohort of individuals that they can sell therapies to, is very small. And it's a much higher risk to develop a therapy for a very niche group of individuals. But that cuts out these individuals from being able to increase their quality of life. So in DeSci, what we're trying to, or what people are trying to build, and what people are successfully building, is a means of which for these patient populations to come together and raise funds to fund the research that may be directly impactful to them. So it's opening up the scientific funding infrastructure to not just high capital net worth accredited investors, but people who are directly impacted by this. So that's one example of the funding structures that are being built in the DeSci space. There are a lot of primitives that are being um, put together to use this. So DAOs are one example of this. So DAOs are decentralized autonomous organizations where people can come together and pool their capital, but not also their experience and their mind share to kind of solve problems. And so they're taking that same approach to address some of these funding issues in DeSci. And one of the main, not it's not a Web3 primitive per se, but one of the main utilities that are being developed out of this are things known as IP NFTs. And so these are a framework that allows for a DAO to help fund a scientific project, a potential therapy or innovation, and also obtain ownership in it. So if you're a patient group, as an example, if you're a patient group and you help fund a therapy that is directly impactful to you, well, you also attain certain ownership over that therapeutic. And how that breaks down is dependent on how the DAO infrastructure has. But this is new. Before, the regular day-to-day Joe did not have an input in what was developed and what was funded.
Yeah, I mean, so I just want to sort of build on that because Jelani alluded to it by saying the DeSci funding connection is there. So the reason, one of the reasons why I think you brought up funding first is because it's definitely the most established and most visible side to DeSci. And I always say that because the funding side is basically DeFi, which is already pretty well established and pretty much built. There's all kinds of different mechanisms that we can use using DeFi to raise funds. Even is it lending? Is it borrowing? Is it crowdsourcing, DAO crowdsourcing? Is it selling NFTs? Is it selling tokens? All this sort of stuff. So that has kind of been built for the past 2.5, 3 years and is sort of pretty successful right now, which is why the funding aspect of DeSci is so powerful. Obviously, funding, aside from the fact that it's already built, is incredibly important to science and to DeSci and to scientists. But it is just one of those things where it's really interesting because it's already built, it is being applied right now to the DeSci space, when actually the DeSci space is 5 or 6 or 7 different levels of, or different categories of things to change, and funding is just one of them. The funding landscape that is being built in DeSci right now, like for example with the IP NFT, this allows you to have more ownership, as Lani said, over the content that you're creating, over the research that you're doing, which is a bit, a big thing. There are a number of other sort of mechanisms being built. I won't go into this one because I don't know it fully so well. It's brand new, but the HyperCert framework, which is being developed by Protocol Labs, is something that's really hot right now on the lips of most DeSci people. So HyperCert frameworks, but I won't try and explain it, I'm afraid. But it's also not just the way of gaining money, but it's also the way of distributing the money and handling the money, which, as Jelani alluded to again with the DAOs, this is what's super important in the DeSci space. It's not just funding for projects and funding for research, but it's also changing the incentive mechanism. Once you get the funding for your grant and then you perform the research, you get your results, or you decide to go further and you go to applied science and you go to actual producing products, how do you share that money? How do you share that funding? You're sharing it with patient groups. This is a huge thing, right? You own your data. Say, for example, you have healthcare data, and rather than the healthcare provider taking your data and using it how they will, you can have ownership over your healthcare data. And companies that want to access your genomic records or want to access some information about your diabetes, they have to pay you directly. So this is all kind of tying in with the funding side of DeSci, and it's really important. It's not just for how do I get money for my research, it's how do I completely flip the script on the incentive mechanisms within science, research, healthcare, all this, using funding or using the blockchain infrastructure.